Good morning. This is the KubeBuilder controller runtime and controller tools meeting for Thursday, May 21st in 2020. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube and publicly available, so don't say anything you don't want recorded for people to find 200 years from now on an archive of all content on the internet. All right, so let's see what's on the agenda. We have two things. Looks like Eric has the first thing, so why don't you take it away, Eric?
Yeah, hey everybody. I want to discuss the difference between the three versions that currently exist in KubeBuilder Master. There's the KubeBuilder binary version that gets released and that people pull from and run the binary for. The project version, which is in the configuration file scaffolded for each KubeBuilder project, and then plugin versions, which are the semantic version attached to the new KubeBuilder CLI plugins that were recently added to Master a few weeks ago. For those who are unfamiliar with CLI plugins, a while back we drafted the idea for a two-phase approach for wrapping the CLI of KubeBuilder in something that's easily exportable, such that with a few lines of code, you could use the KubeBuilder CLI in a custom way and iterate on top of that scaffolding that KubeBuilder provides. The second phase is going to be something that we'll be working on that deals with a more fine-grained approach to modifying the base scaffold that KubeBuilder provides. But right now, phase one is what is in Master, and phase one provides a few things and changes the project layout a little bit. So it provides a versioning scheme and a fully qualified naming scheme for plugins. It provides a few interfaces for defining plugins, and it adds the layout key to the project's configuration file, which says what plugin a project was created with, and then also the plugins key in the project configuration, which holds projects or plugin-specific configuration objects. So we have these three versions, and there seems to be a little bit of confusion between these three, mostly between the project version and the plugin version. So I want to talk about the difference between those two and whether or not we agree on those things and a potential problem that has come up recently to do with the plugin version. So project version is the version of the project configuration file format. So in V1, we had one format, and V2 we added resources and possibly one other thing, if I remember correctly. And then in V3, which is currently V3 Alpha, we've added the layout key and the plugins key. So based on the project version, we know what is going to be in the project file, what we can assume will be there, and KubeBuilder can say whether it supports the current version being used or not. Now, the plugin version is different. That's what will go in the layout key, and it is only relevant for, right now, project versions V2 and V3. The reason I say it's relevant for project versions is because plugins need to support a particular project version because all KubeBuilder projects have a project version. That's part of the plugin interface spec. But it's different from the project version because plugin version is specifically talking about the scaffolds and what that plugin knows about at that particular point in its development lifecycle. At the point that it's released, it knows that I can scaffold these things based on this version that's in the layout key. So they are different and should be differentiated when bumping either version. So for example, if the project file, the project configuration file format changes, then there needs to be a bump in the project version. But if there's only a change in scaffolding, let's say because this is a relevant issue that we brought up last time, we moved the API and controller directories under PKG, then if we only scaffold that type of project going forward, then we need to bump the plugin version itself because the underlying scaffolds that the plugin deals with have changed. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, good. Jake Silence says maybe. So
yeah.
The thing that we have realized when working with these plugins in the SDK is that I guess I should start with a question. So what does a patch version bump for a plugin look like? Typically, patches are non-breaking changes that deal with bug fixes. I don't necessarily know what a scaffolding bug fix would look like that isn't also a breaking change by necessity.
So at least I'll give like kind of two answers. So the first answer is I'd expect at very least the category of things of like you gave an input that causes the plugin to panic. That's clearly a bug. Fixing it so that the plugin no longer panics seems to be pretty clearly a bug fix in my head. Like I was just trying to think of like a category of things that are like, this is kind of unambiguously we could consider a bug fix. So that's at least some set of things that I'd consider to be in that kind of patch category for a plugin. So the other thing, and this applies a little bit more to features versus breaking changes than patches, is I think you could probably consider it's not a breaking change if you can safely run the new version of the plugin against the existing, something scaffolded with the existing version of the plugin and not change anything. So right. If you add something to a file that's generated once, that's like only ever generated at the start, you might consider that a non-breaking change.
Yeah, and I agree with both of those definitions. I ask, hold on 1 sec. And so I ask, does a patch version actually matter then when encoding this in a plugin's version? Like if both of those things don't matter, then why not just get rid of patch versions altogether and use major and minor, right? Because if you can match the layout key, the version in the layout key against the major and minor version, then patch version doesn't matter.
Hold on. Let's. I think someone had a question first.
Yeah.
And then
Camilla, go ahead.
I'll answer that. Was that Camilla?
Yeah, I just think that would be easier go through this discussion because it's kind of confusion. We have three different types of versions. If we come back one step and you think about the concept. So just to clarify, can I, as a contributor, do a change that will result a break change for V2 projects? For example, if I would like to do a fix that will be a break change, okay, I will do a new version of the plugin. Since is a break change, it will be a upper bump. But this plugin could not be executed, in my opinion, in the V2 project, for example, in an old project. I'm right, just to confirm. Like I'm just trying to define here the purpose of each version, you know. Is my understanding correctly that the purpose of the project versions are related to the scaffold? What I'm trying to say is, my understanding so far is that for we move from V1 to V2, uh, which has breakchains in the scaffold project, we created this version, and you have a migration guide. So in the KubeBuilder, if I want to, for any reason, introduce some break change, I need to go for an upper version of the project version. Any break change for the scaffolded projects. This, the relation about the project version is the version related of the scaffolded version. The scaffold project.
Camilla,
This makes sense.
So Eric and Sully, correct me if I get this wrong, but I think what's happening as part of the move to project version 3 is that project version, as of project version 3, no longer means, no longer has a relation to the scaffold. In 1 and 2, it did because there was only ever a Go project version. We never had this layout concept and this plugin concept. But now with project version 3, that version is now scoped down to just cover what plugins can expect to find in the project version file itself. And then everything else about the scaffold and what that plugin supports when it inits a project is handled via its own layout key.
That's correct. Yeah, we used to conflate the two, and now they're separate. Yep.
Yeah, my goal is just to try to figure out how, for example, as a contributor, I can add a new change, a break change, a new version of a plugin, and if it is plugin, should be available for the old versions of projects as well, or just for the latest one. This is the point of that pull request. You know, it's like a proof of concept for we try to understand and define how we could move forward to add new things.
So
Okay.
Go ahead, Sully.
So okay. So let's tackle that next in a moment. Let me answer the question about patch, what I think about the question about patch versions, and then we can segue into that, because that is a good question too. So as for patch versions, I am not sure it's strictly useful in the project context. I think you might be right. Like, I think only major and minor might be useful in the project file itself.
I was actually wondering,
But,
Sully, if you think that like is minor even useful? Like if we're not making a breaking change to the plugin, like then theoretically the plugin could be updated underneath of an existing project with non-breaking changes, whether they're new features or bug fixes, and existing projects on that major version should keep working. So this is the question I was bringing up to Eric. Should we just have a major version number in the layout key only?
yeah, I was like, literally, it's funny, literally as I was saying the words I was just saying, that thought was occurring to me.
Yeah.
That seems reasonable to me right now, but it's possible that there's something we're missing. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts, please do feel free to speak up. But I do, yeah, I think it kind of sounds reasonable just to have a major version, because that's the thing here that like a plugin would have to check compatibility with.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I could potentially see a case where you'd actually, now that I'm thinking about it, where you'd want the minor version. So if you make an improvement and there's somehow like an old version of the plugin that doesn't know about that addition, and it tries to scaffold new files, that might confuse things. So like, let's say you have version 3.1, and then I guess that would be breaking.
Yeah, I think
You're saying like if you go backwards, like if you've scaffolded a project that, and the layout key says version 2, but really the plugin was version 2.1, let's say, and it does some stuff, and then somehow for whatever reason you're using a binary that doesn't support 3.1 or 2.1 but supports 2, so like everything still seemingly works, but really in fact whatever that 2.1 improvement was is a change insofar as the plugin that you're using that is a version 2.0 plugin doesn't work for some reason.
Yeah, but I think as I'm saying it, necessarily any such change would have to be breaking.
Would we be able to anticipate? I guess we probably would. Like we could anticipate all of those.
So I think for scaffolding stuff, it is something we can anticipate and be like, if you have to have a case where if you're adding some new thing to scaffolding, then you have to consider the case where, like if you do not consider the case where this thing you assume to exist does not exist, then you must make a breaking change. But if you build in logic to be like backwards compatible, then we don't have to make a breaking change. Scaffolding versioning seems it's weird because everything is a breaking change in some manner of speaking.
Yeah, almost across the board.
Yeah, if we add a new file, for example, you'll not be a break change. If we add something new, you'll not be a break change, but many things can be a break change. I agree.
Well,
Yeah,
I think like if you add a new file and like change the make file in an updated version of an existing plugin, like that could be a breaking change, because if you go back to an older version, the addition of that file might somehow break something from the older version. It's hard to talk about this because we have nothing concrete to kind of work through.
Let's make that concrete then. There was a proposal a while ago to add a .docker ignore file. So I'm going to make an argument that it is both a breaking change and not a breaking change, and we'll see which one holds water. So the argument that it is not a breaking change is that you're probably scaffolding the docker ignore file out on project init. And so nothing else would need to update it or modify it. So whether or not it's there is kind of immaterial except to the scaffolded project, right? So if it's there, you get nice behavior around like not accidentally copying in extraneous stuff during your build phase. And so it's just kind of a user visible feature. But like adding a new file or something probably isn't going to change it if we structure it correctly. However, the point at which it becomes a breaking change is if for some reason, like KubeBuilder create controller needs to then modify that docker ignore file. I think the way the docker ignore file was proposed with a whole bunch of wildcards means that should not be the case. But you don't know if a plugin might start adding stuff to that. So like potentially even that thing that seems like it could be a non-breaking change could be a breaking change in the future. Now, potentially a plugin could deal with that if it had like a minor version or something. A plugin could say if there is a Docker ignore file, add to it. If there's not, don't. But that's kind of like something we need to decide.
So in that case, I think that's a good example. So in that case, I think what we're basically saying is like if you scaffold something during init and then you expect that thing to be there during other commands, or even if you scaffold something, basically if you scaffold any files and then later expect them to be there in other commands, then that's potentially a breaking change because older versions of that plugin don't know about the presence of that. But if your plugin is smart enough to handle the presence or non-presence of that file, then it would not be a breaking change.
The question is also, do other, like if when we have multiple plugins, or when we have multiple plugins as part of phase 2, do other plugins expect that to be there, right? Like,
So I would say that we shouldn't worry about, because we should, in the spec for phase 2, say if you are a phase 2 plugin and you expect things to be there, then the burden of proof is on you, and you need to check what the layout key is to make sure that you are receiving the right input. Because then I think we get into like dependency management with plugin versions, and I don't think we want that. Does that sound like the direction we would be going in that case?
Yeah, I think that seems reasonable. I think that makes maybe a little bit of an argument that we should continue to have a minor version. Sort of a plugin is just like, well, I'm not going to do feature detection, and I just always need, the version of, at least the version of this with the Docker ignore file. It can just hard bail and be like, I don't really want to be used with this layout.
Right.
That means that plugins need to have like, basically all of them theoretically would need to do like semantic version range checking and stuff like that.
I mean, at the very least, all plugins need to be aware of the base layout with which they work. Right, like if you try to use like a plugin that's expecting a Go v2 project with like a Go v7 project,
I guess what I'm asking is like if it's Go v2 versus Go v7, it's a really simple like, does this equal? Well, I guess even in that case, like, is it at least v2, right? Like maybe you say that you're going to support v2 through v4, but not v5 and v6 and v7. So I guess you still have the problem of semantic range checking even with just major versions.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think the semantic range checking probably won't end up being, famous last words, probably won't end up being too complicated. It'll probably be like, is major version 2, like, is major version equal 2? And then like sometimes it might be, is minor version greater than 2 or equal to 2, right? Like, I don't think it's going to be like crazy complicated, like major version 2 less than 4 except not 3.6.
Yeah. I hope not.
I really hope not. If any plugin starts doing that, I think we need to reevaluate.
If that happens, we're probably in a situation where we've had tons of success with plugins and we have an entire repository of plugins that crazy numbers of people are using, and there's like weird plugin authors that screw something up on accident. So that's probably a success problem.
Okay. So does that, have we reached consensus?
So we want a major and a minor, and that's it?
Yeah, I think so.
So in my mind, that opens another question, which I think like right now based on that, there's a fix that we're going to make to remove the patch version, but then there's a current bug, I think, where right now we're only doing like exact matching of layout keys with plugins. So we probably need to, like, if your project file says I support version, I was scaffolded with plugin version 2.0, and then later there's a 2.1 plugin. What do we do?
I think we use the 2.1 plugin.
Yeah.
I think match major version exactly, and increment.
Auto increment that version in the file.
Yeah, and I don't think we auto.
We would probably have to say you do this yourself and be aware of what has changed between these two minor versions, because there could be what we consider a non-breaking change that eventually becomes a breaking change, like the scenario that you posed, Zoe. And we want a user to add a file or something that the command that they will be using after init won't actually add that file. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure we'd ever want to have that, like, have that be the case.
Like,
realistically,
realistically,
we just want to like prompt the user and say like, hey, we noticed your layout version key is this. We have a plugin that is like an improvement on that. Do you want to use it? Like, are you okay with this? If yes, like, great, we'll do it. And then we could potentially also have either part of that same prompt, or as a separate prompt say, do you want us to auto update your file? And then if there was no difference between what the plugin version supported and what the layout key said, then you wouldn't have to do any of this prompting. So it only happened if there's this discrepancy. Would that solve the problem in the right way?
I think so. I think it makes the plugin author's life more complicated here.
Which aspect? Like, is
Doing-
that plugin author problem?
Potentially doing the updating.
Couldn't that be something that the CLI, like backend components do?
So like, do you mean updating like the project structure as well as the plugin key, or just the plugin key?
So it was just suggested that we would also like add missing files and stuff, right?
Oh,
So
yeah. I guess I wasn't suggesting that.
Yeah, what I was saying is we need to document what changes between minor versions of a plugin, and have like a migration guide for each new KubeBuilder CLI release, each new KubeBuilder binary bump, kind of like what we do in the SDK, where we say these things have changed, bump in your Go mod file, bump the version of your operator SDK dependency and make these changes to your project. We could do the same thing in KubeBuilder. And so every time a new binary is released that has a new plugin version, then you need to make these changes and manually bump the layout key in your project file.
Yeah, and I kind of think that the scope of non-breaking change, what we might consider to be non-breaking, is so small that actually we could do the migration, like, and it'd almost always be, I think the class of things that we'd want to do there would almost always be ensure a file exists. We kind of could have a KubeBuilder migrate or a KubeBuilder version bump command that fixed that. That was just like, make sure all the files that init thinks exist should exist. And I think any other type of change is probably going to end up being breaking.
Do you think so? Like, what about the case where like you do an init and a version 2.1 of the plugin adds a new target? And it's just like a new convenience thing.
Yeah, we might.
In that case, like
doesn't that necessarily have to be breaking based on the situation we just discussed, where like future dependencies assume that something might exist? So like I guess that I'm still unsure as to what wouldn't be a breaking change given that supposition.
So, okay. Yeah. Uh, hmm. So
Yeah,
the
the
other
only
option we have here is to punt and say we just have a major for now. And if we find we end up on like major version 37 real quick and people start complaining, we could start adding in minors.
Well, the alternative to that is actually keeping the major and the minor. And then if we find that we're still bumping the major a lot and not the minor very often, then we can just remove the minor.
Yeah, that works too.
Yeah, I would prefer the Eric's suggestion.
Okay. Yeah, I think we just have to be very careful with the minor then.
Yeah.
But it's still unclear to me, like the example I gave of the make file, and we're adding a make target. Unless, like, I guess it's possible for plugins to like run make targets, but that seems like an odd thing potentially for them to do. So there seems like there's like a class of things that, well, I guess that's not true, right? Like a init runs make stuff, right?
Also, you could scaffold out additional make files that included the base make file and then try to run those targets. Like, make targets are public variables.
Well, here's even a better example, I guess. Let's say I added a new init thing that just fixed, well, let's say added some comments in a Go file, right? Would that just be a patch? No change at all?
I believe that the question, if I would decide if it's a patch or not, I believe the question will be, my project built with the tool, you'll be affected, you'll stop to work with that. I don't know if he just to try make simple, like the Docker file. If the new Docker file that the new version of plugin you add will it break something because the key features do not expect it to have the Docker file, but it doesn't have it there before. So what problem it can cause,
Yeah, I think the hard part is like there's clearly like a set of things that if you change, like things break. I think there's like a large class of things that's like if you change it, maybe things break because there's some other things that may depend on that, but it's hard to know for sure, especially in the plugins v2 world where there's follow-on plugins that are running. So I guess what I'm asking, like, is like in that second class of things, like when we tell a plugin author how to version their plugin, like what guidance? I guess what it boils down to is what guidance are we giving plugin authors for how to version their stuff,
yes.
and like what things can reasonably be considered non-breaking, and what things should we say are breaking, even if it like and be very conservative about that, so that lots of things are breaking. I don't know. It seems like a tough problem.
I think maybe we might want to move that actually, because we've had a lot of thoughts bouncing around. I think we might want to move that into an issue so that we can record them a little bit more coherently. I think we have a little bit of consensus. So maybe we can start with that. Sorry, I interrupted you, Camilla.
No, sorry. I just should say that I created an issue in the repo before, just before we try to clarify the purpose of each version, and how, as a contributor, how I exactly that's like the guidance, like Joe spoke, how I know when I should bump the big one, the medium one, how I should work with that.
Yeah, I can summarize everything that we talked about today in an issue after this and address your concerns. Yeah, it sounds like we need to have a spec as to what exactly a non-breaking versus a breaking change is. And I for like for future discussion, I do think that we can concretely define these things and that this isn't an unsolvable problem. It's going to require some assessment of a lot of PRs, but I'm hoping that it won't add, like the way that we define this won't add a significant amount more work to each PR that changes the scaffolded file. That's my main goal with this, because I don't want to have us debating what version, whether it's major or minor, needs to be bumped on each PR.
Agreed. I'll leave one last thing for people to maybe ponder in the time between when we have the issue and now, which is perhaps a way to look at that is like in terms of, in essence, like public variables versus not public variables, but kind of extended to all files. So if you could conceivably reference a change in another file, then it should be breaking. And if you could not reference a change in another file, then it perhaps could be considered non-breaking. So like adding a new public variable to main.go could be considered breaking because something else would probably want to reference it. Adding a private variable might not be because something else probably wouldn't want to reference it. You know, kind of same with the make file targets.
It seems like a lot of the scaffolding KubeBuilder project is public, though.
Yes, I think that's certainly true.
But even in that example, Sully, like if it's a private variable in the main.go scaffold, and I have another plugin that wants to change that private unexported variable, it's all just string manipulation under the hood. So like all strings and all files are necessarily public, right?
I think we maybe make a kind of, we might want to make a hard statement that say like inter-plugin dependencies should like you can safely expect that like inter-package dependencies won't change if you are two plugins cross-referencing things, but you cannot, like without looking at the version, you cannot safely expect that like private variables won't change.
Yeah. Also, if your plugin is like, I want to say if your plugin is brittle enough that it breaks because of some minor positional changes in the document, then maybe it's a good like time to reassess how your plugin is written. But at the same time, we're literally giving them like a Go document in text form in bytes. Or that's the proposed idea.
I'd largely expect people that are doing like file manipulation like that to be doing a very mostly constrained set of operations. And if they're outside of this set of operations, I'm kind of like, well, you're doing something that might be a little brittle. But like the things that I'd expect you to be able to do are like Go path rewriting, which like you know, adding /package, or like if the file has an area that's like a, you know, all schemes are below this line, like we do in main.go, and you can add new schemes by, you know, adding something below or above that line, you know, being able to add an additional thing. And so like that set of changes would generally be considered safe because like removing that line is probably a breaking change. And so that line is kind of like the public interface. But like if your plugin is depending on some random line being present somewhere that's not like declared as explicitly this is a scaffolding point, then like, yeah, you're probably doing something weird that we don't want to consider.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that using like, or if the plugin is checking, like the phase 2 plugin is checking the version, then um, like if there is a problem that we didn't see, then they'll like raise an issue in the repo. But realistically, I don't think it's going to necessarily be a big problem for downstream phase 2 plugins. Yeah, I'm just hoping that like you're saying, they're either robust or they break because they weren't written well.
Yeah. I have on this subject, I have one other thing. I think Camilla might have been asking about it. I'm not sure, but at the very least, she inspired me to think about it a little bit, which is plugin the built-in plugins. I think we just want to tie the built-in plugins to the KubeBuilder version. So like if you make a breaking change to a built-in plugin, then you have to, that's considered also to be a major change to KubeBuilder itself. But I'm open for other opinions on that. Because like we're gonna have to quote unquote release the built-in plugins with versions of KubeBuilder, or as part of versions of KubeBuilder.
Yeah, we actually were talking about this a little bit with relation to some of the SDK plugins we're thinking about doing, and the way we thought about it was, if there's a new version of if there's a breaking change in the Go scaffold provided by KubeBuilder, that doesn't necessarily mean a breaking change in KubeBuilder, and kind of thinking about from the SDK perspective. We were thinking if the existing plugin remains in tree, like is supported by the newer version of the KubeBuilder binary. So let's say we have, like, let's just go with a concrete example. We have V2 KubeBuilder Go plugin, and we're talking about a breaking change that adds a V3 KubeBuilder Go plugin. So I think our thought was, you can bump to version KubeBuilder v2.1 if you keep the KubeBuilder version 2 plugin supported. But if you remove the V2 KubeBuilder plugin, then and you replace it with the V3 KubeBuilder plugin, then it has to be a breaking change on the KubeBuilder repo itself.
I think that seems reasonable.
I don't know, maybe I'm silly, sorry for my silly questions, but for example, that pull request that is in the agenda, that is the proof of a concept, it's a small, really small change that if we do that change in the scaffold, you break the V2 projects, okay? So theoretically should be, I understand, an upper version of the plugin, the 3.0. So my question is, should the 3.0 also be available for V2, or in this case, only for V3 alpha? Do you know? Because it is like I'm trying just to figure out if I introduce a break change in the plugin now, this will affect V2 and V3. Should we affect the V2 or not? And have a migration guide or for all changes like that? How will we work with that?
I think we should largely consider V2 to be the V2 project version to be frozen, and like new breaking changes should affect like new versions of the Go layout with V3 alpha and above project versions.
So it means that we need a new structure, like in that pull request of V3 plugins. We will do the same like the other one, but the scaffold is different.
Well, doesn't that kind of go back to conflating the project version and the plugin version again? Like I guess because V2 project version 2 was pre-plugins, then any changes that we make to plugins, like shouldn't affect it because we were using that as like the plugin version effectively.
Yeah. So saying project version 2 in your project file is kind of semantically equivalent to saying project version 3 alpha layout 2.0. And so you wouldn't expect layout 2.0 to change.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. And so you'd have to do, if it was a breaking change, you'd have to do layout go/3.0. And there's no way to express go/3.0 in project version 2. So like project version 2 should not change.
Okay.
This was my
So
first question. Really, thanks.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and also brings up a second, a follow-up question to that. This is more of an implementation detail. So when we bump a plugin version, whether major or minor, given how things are set up right now, we necessarily have to create like a new package for that new plugin version in KubeBuilder, in package plugins. And we also, I guess, need to decide whether we want like each KubeBuilder binary to support multiple plugins of the same name with different versions. So if you don't want to upgrade, then you can still use the current layout key. And therefore, we do have to duplicate some code potentially.
Do we want to change the interface slightly so that a plugin receives the... I mean, I guess a plugin knows the version that it's being called with because it can look at the layout key. So hypothetically, if your plugin is simple enough and there's just like minor changes between V2 and V3, you don't have to duplicate, or you can import a lot of the scaffolding code.
Yeah, I think
although that's how we ended up with the old scaffolding mess that a bunch of folks recently extracted us from, where we had like all sorts of things depending on other things, and it was kind of a nightmare.
So just to confirm my understanding, so if me or any developer in the community decide to do something that is a break change, this will be a new plugin version 3.0, and this cannot change the old layout of project versions V2. This will be a change just in V3 alpha. When the V3 alpha be a stable one, cannot happen. Needs to be V4, and consequently, is right, my understatement.
I think, Camilla, if you want to make a breaking change to an existing plugin's scaffolding, then the way things work now is you basically have to create a new plugin that returns its new layout key. And when you call the init and create API, create webhook commands, like it'll do those things. So it's basically a brand new plugin. And I think what Sully was saying is like there's potentially like tons and tons of overlap between version 2 and version 3. So we have to like, this is probably like a separate question potentially, but we have to figure out like how do we share that code between version 2 and version 3 plugins, or do we?
Camilla, when you were saying V3 alpha, were you talking about project
Yes,
version?
I'm talking about the project version.
So I largely think once we hit V3 stable, we're not going to change that again for a while. Like, and that's going to be completely independent of plugin version. So like we might do plugin version, V4, V5, V6, V7, and project version is just going to stick at V3.
Okay, so then we would need V4, V5, V6, and however, we create new versions, all supported in V3. All these plugins will support the same project version. And we would choose the upper one. I likely will choose the 4. Now I have the 5, so I would like to use the 5. But for the users that has the project scaffold with the tool, we need a migration guide. in the case it has because it has a breaking change. So the 4 to 5 plugin requires a migration guide.
Yes. Yeah. We probably, plugins would want to have migration guides, correct, the same way we do with the V1 to V2 migration guide in KubeBuilder.
So, and okay, then now has other question that I made for Eric. Maybe I am silly, but all will be stable in V3. So what will be the purpose of the project version after that, you know, in the future? Because we will change the plugins versions and we kill the concept of the project versions, because before was this stuff, though, no breaking changes, and now we can introduce breaking changes and make the migration guides based in the plugin versions.
So I expect the only time we'll want to change project version is if, like, project version is now an indicator of the structure of that project file. So like, let's say we rearrange the layout, or we change the name of one of the keys in the project file, or we decide that like we're really bored and all the YAML keys are now Unicode emoji characters. Then we'd have project version v4, because, you know, we've changed layout to be the layout key to be a house emoji. That's kind of a silly example, but like, you know, it does happen sometimes that the structure of that configuration file might change. If we look at like other projects, like we might decide that we want to rename, like we want to merge the layout key and the extra plugins configuration key into like a single list or a single dictionary. In that case, where we've changed the actual structure of the project file such that a KubeBuilder, a base KubeBuilder that was an older version of the base KubeBuilder could not read the new project file, then we'd have to increment the project file version.
So okay, so this is a good definition. So if we change the structure of the project file that represents the structure of the build project, we will bump the project version. Otherwise, any future break changes, we will bump just the plugin versions.
Correct. Yep.
Perfect. Really, thank you. This is very delightful.
And yeah, I think that is worth, like, I think it's worth recording those examples in our documentation as like here's an example of why either of these things would happen.
Sure.
Yeah. I agree. And also, we're running out of time here. I just want to say that we should probably have some documentation talking about everything that we've discussed here before we release the next version. Does that sound like a reasonable thing?
I agree.
Okay, so I will get started on that.
And I think circling back, it sounds like there's a bug fix or a feature that we need to do to support like the semantic version plugin execution against older versions. I guess that's something we'll cover in the issue you create, Eric, but that seems like something that needs to be fixed fairly quickly, also before we release.
Yeah, I think we should go from issue discussion to proposal to implementation. And the proposal can either act as the spec for future version bumps for plugins and projects, or we can create another doc depending on what's encapsulated in that proposal.
Yeah, I just think that probably needs to happen fairly quickly because we're kind of blocking a release at this point if we want to make that change.
All right, I think we have like 1 minute left by my estimation since the last time I checked the clock. We have like less than that. We have like 15 seconds. All right, so in summary, we have a whole bunch of things to record, which we will do. And I will see y'all next week.
Really thank you. Really thank you, folks. Was very good the discussion today.